Thank you so much. Good morning and good afternoon, everyone. My name is Adam Basenti. I'm a Community Development Specialist at the National Indian Child Welfare Association in Portland, Oregon. And I always like to introduce myself in my tribal language as well. Yat Eish Adam Basenti, Yinashet, Sanajini Nishle, Sanaha Bitli Pashichi, Tobaha, Dasche, Todachi, Dashanella. I'm originally from Gallup, New Mexico, right outside of the Navajo Reservation, and have been residing in Portland for about almost 6 years now. As a community development specialist with NICWA, we work with systems of care, tribal communities, and assist tribes in strengthening and building children's mental health systems within a tribal context. And today's presentation is touching on a topic that I believe a lot of folks have heard about, or at least maybe even wrestled with, or are currently practicing in the area of policy. Policy is often something that is emphasized, sometimes overemphasized, or emphasized not enough in terms of creating change that is sustainable. And so today's webinar, I am going to be previewing and introducing you to content that is in a tribal policy guide that is currently being worked on. Now, this guide is soon to be released in spring of this year, but I thought it would be good to start to introduce the content and be able to gather some feedback and ideas and thoughts about this particular guide. And so I apologize if you were expecting to receive a guide at the end of this, but we can certainly connect, and I'm willing to share this guide once it is fully finished. But at the same time, you will be able to see and really get a chance to hear some of the ideas that are coming out of this guide. And so I just wanted to at least make that clear in terms of the expectations of this particular presentation today. So I wanted to make sure that folks are aware that this webinar is hosted by the National Indian Child Welfare Association and partner with the National TA Network for Children's Behavioral Health, operated by and coordinated through the University of Maryland. Now, I've been wrestling with this topic of policy for quite some time, and was able to go to school with a focus on policy and policy development. And so, honestly, growing up hearing about policy within my tribal context, it was not always mentioned, or at least had a positive connotation. And learning more about policy and the interaction with tribal nations, and some of you are maybe aware of this, that the policies that impacted tribal communities historically were not always productive or healthy, and at times not in the best interests of native tribal nations. Things have certainly changed over the decades in terms of how policy is used in tribal communities, although there still is a large base of tribal community members, tribal nations that feel that policy is something that is over their heads, is not fully understood, and so this was a thought of mine, and I was starting to really understand when I started working at NICWA and also working with other tribal communities before this position. I began to understand that, again, policy was not always framed in the best light, and tribal community members thought of policy that was just law and that was it. And so I wondered about how policy could be consumed in a way where it is understood and it is used for the benefits of the community. And so was playing with some ideas around this topic, and at that time, about a year ago, was able to attend a presentation at the Northwest Portland Area Indian Health Board here in Portland, Oregon. And the topic was around community norms and community protocol. And so I was able to link with the health board and basically form a team and start working on developing somewhat of a guide or a document for tribes to basically have or frame policy through that tribal context. And so there, I found like-minded individuals, that were native, that were also working with tribal communities in delivering technical assistance and support. And so they found the very same challenges that I did in regards to working with tribes and tribes, understanding policy to an extent, but also, taking time for that to sink in. And this is not to say that tribes, are not able to fully grasp it. I feel like just in terms of how we portray policy at times and sometimes in the context that we use, it could easily go over the heads of folks in the community. And when we think about our families and our youth and their thoughts on policy, that understanding is not there as well. And so we certainly recognize this misunderstanding of policy and started to think about, ways that we could come together and develop something, material, content that would really begin to frame policy in a way that is in the tribal context, that speaks and connects to how tribal communities think about life, think about how they maintain their community. And so that's where this sort of content and the creation of this guide started, was just by these discussions of challenges we've seen in our practices, at NICWA, at the Northwest Portland Area Indian Health Board. And so we begin on this journey in developing a guide, that was essentially geared towards supporting tribal communities as they develop community-driven and culturally informed policy that is connecting with the tribal context. And so when I say tribal context, I'm speaking about a area or context where language, where cultural practices, where customs, where traditions are very unique and distinct as they are displayed within a tribal community. And so as folks maybe on the line are aware, when you are working within a tribal community and you're delivering services or you are supporting a community, you all know that not all communities are the same. And especially if you're working with diverse underrepresented communities or communities of color, you understand that the services must be tailored, toward the population as well as that context there. And so that is something that we are very mindful of when we're thinking about this policy guide. And so we thought about this development, this policy development within that context, and I thought about it, basically focusing our guide on that community-based piece that is independent of the federal or state or even tribal laws, but more, focusing on the aspect of the local community. And so this work certainly is directed towards some of our systems of care populations and the folks that are, on the ground in the community. And so that was something that I also thought about just in terms of that population and being able to focus on tribes that are within their communities, either rural, sometimes urban as well, but are basically charged with developing policy for their systems of care. So looking at it from that context there, that's basically the focus of our particular guide, is for those folks that are in the community that are tribal members, that are either rural or urban areas there. And again, when you're thinking about community members, who is that? Who are those community members, and who are the folks that honestly could use a guide such as this? And what comes to mind is youth and families, right? When we're thinking in the systems of care world, we're thinking of those two populations, youth and families, as driving this process here. And so honestly, it's sort of natural for them to be, it's natural for a technical assistance provider to arm them, to provide tools for youth and families, such as education of policy, so that they are the primary drivers of this. They again are the heart and soul of a lot of our communities here, and so that's the audience that we're gearing towards. And honestly, what separates our guide, and you'll get to see this here in a bit, is really the theoretical framework that we're using in regards to the relational worldview. But again, also the language and translation used throughout the guide. We want to have to talk about policy, but also have a crosswalk and have a translation, again, where it connects with tribal communities and also be easier to digest and to consume, and that is also applicable to a tribal context and relevant to folks that are living within tribal areas. And so thinking about the organization of this policy, we tried to obviously make it very clear, easy to read, easy to follow, and so we divided it 8 sections in appendix. We also have a policy process, which I'll show you, that is very standard, but also is sometimes new to folks. And then we've included tools, which I'll introduce later in this presentation here. So let's start with the more critical aspects or important aspects of this guide here, and that's the framing of policy through a tribal lens. Now, in tribal communities, there are traditional forms, traditional customs, should I say, or traditional cultural etiquette and instruction on how to conduct behavior. Now, a lot of these customs, these etiquettes and instruction, which is basically protocol, is tied to history, is tied to stories and origins, and that have been around since time immemorial. And so these stories, these customs, these etiquette on how to conduct yourself is often passed down to tribal members, from grandparents to parents to their sons and daughters, and so forth. And for me, as a Navajo kid growing up, my dad took me and introduced me to a lot of our ceremonies, which his father was leading. He was a medicine person, and so when I was in those, was in the room, was experiencing, what was happening. One thing I was told to observe how things are happening, how things are unfolding, but observing also, what people are doing, how they are moving, how they are responding, what they're saying, what they're not saying. And so all of those things were basically the etiquette that was a part of this ceremony here. And so it was my job to be able to learn this and to respect this, because that's basically what we needed to do and to follow in order to make sure that the respect is given to that process there. And so this cultural etiquette is basically protocol that occurs in these spaces, such as a ceremony, but also spaces such as like weddings or hunting parties or preparing food, and other cultural contexts and situations here. And so when our team, NICWA as well as the health board, were thinking about, again, policy and also how do we make it digestible for folks, so where people can understand it and connect with and fully grasp it. And so that's when we started to think about and rely on this cultural protocol, that we've all are connected to. And this cultural protocol or tribal protocol that a lot of our tribal communities have practiced since time immemorial. And thinking about this cultural etiquette and this tribal protocol, how things unfold and how things are implemented, and the outcome of this tribal protocol is very similar to policy, and very similar to how policy works. The purposes of policy, is often there to guide behavior, right? Behavior of individuals, behavior of organizations, behavior of employees, on how they should conduct themselves in those particular spaces. And so it occurred to us that we could link the word policy and with tribal protocol and framing it through this particular lens here, because language is certainly important when we're speaking with our communities, speaking with community members, and also how we are able to frame our words and frame some of the topics that we're trying to impart or get across. And so it's very important that we are careful with our language. And so in thinking about policy through tribal protocol, this is something that tribal folks can understand, that grasp, because again, they know what tribal protocol is. They know what the purpose is. They know what can be used for. And so using this as a crosswalk to understand policy is really what we tried to do, and made sure that this is how we could relate this information here. Now, getting started in developing this guide, it took some time, but one of the first checklists that we sort of came up with, and thinking about, when we're thinking of developing policy, writing policy, or even, if we did write policy, what could we use to compare it to, or, to make sure that policy is seen through a tribal lens and is similar to protocol. And so we came up with some questions that would relate to, how policy could be more culturally informed and be able to be respectful of tribal communities and sovereignty and self-determination. And so if you look at this tribal protocol checklist, these probably are not your average questions that you would ask in terms of assessing if your policy is effective or not. This checklist here is more of thinking again about how your policy could, be respectful of your elders, and I put that at the very top. What would your elders think of this policy? And that is very important and critical because they are often serving as gatekeepers, they're wisdom keepers, storytellers, and leaders of the community. They guide. They are sort of like your Supreme Court, right, in terms of making the final decisions on a lot of things. And so a lot of what happens in tribal communities does pass through elders and do sometimes need that approval and before going forward. And so I think that that's a really good question to ask in this process here. Secondly, looking at how does policy reflect tribal beliefs, values, principles, philosophy of the community, I think is another critical question. That is a part of being culturally informed, making sure that the beliefs, the values, the principles are encompassed or embodied in this particular policy here. Going down, is customary law or protocol intertwined in the policy? And as I mentioned, I didn't mention, but natural law, customary law have been around long before policy was introduced to tribal communities. And these sort of unwritten laws are teachings that are passed down to tribal members. And these laws, honestly, are still followed today, for the traditional tribal community members that are out there that have these teachings. They know that they must always consider their actions and how it may interfere or interact with customary law, natural law, spiritual laws, because we know that what we're living right now, there's more to life. There's a spiritual side as well, but I don't want to get too deep into that. But it's basically looking at some of the other aspects of a Native perspective, and also what is considered, in living in this world. It's not just the average law. There are laws that run very deep within tribal communities. But thinking about policy, does it interact with those laws? Does it support those laws? Does it also respect those laws? But this is just something that we started with, and really we started to use this as ways to continue to further our work and further the guide as we continue to develop and moving forward. And so these next couple of slides, I'm going to be talking about the conceptual framework, utilizing the relational worldview that is rooted in indigenous thought. And Dr. Terry Cross here at the National Indian Child Welfare Association sophisticated that model and has put out that model as a means of understanding life, understanding health and well-being of individuals and families. And so we've used that as one of our key staples throughout this particular guide. Now, when it comes to health and well-being, how we frame that is through the balances and imbalances of those aspects there. And so I'll get into that piece here in a bit, but then also restoring balance and basically making things healthy again, making things, working at full capacity. And I'll share some examples here. And so getting into the relational worldview conceptual model, Terry Cross and there's a lot of other models out there that are very similar. And so there's no one particular model here, but multiple perspectives. Because as you know, there's over 500 different tribal nations out there, all with a different understanding that is more than likely holistic. But sort of starting off with this framework here, we understood that the relational worldview, when you're looking at the individual level, you have context, which is things that are happening outside yourself. You have your mind, which is your thoughts. You have spiritual pieces, things, your beliefs, but also your physical aspects of the individual. And so that's what Terry created within that individual model. Now that individual model also can be looked at organizationally. As some of you may refer to your organizations as living beings as well. And so with an organization, you have environments, you have your infrastructure, you have your mission and resources. So we took that even further and looked at a community. So we went from individual, organization, and to the community level. And so what you see on this particular slide, starting with the top left area, is the community environment. So what is the community environment? Well, it's your economic, your social environment, but it's also the history of your community, things that have gone on, the institutions, the organizations, everything that is in that aspect of environment in the community there. And if you go to your right, the community infrastructure, it's your services in your community, the capacity of your community. You continue on down to the community resources, that is, the people in your community, the cultural practices, the traditions that are held within that community. And then you move over to the community mission, which is also looking at, the traditions and the mission of that community. Is it a very traditional community where maybe events, spiritual events are certainly emphasized. So this particular model here is something that we feel communities, can be able to kind of understand from that larger picture of, is their community healthy? Is their community balanced? And how this works is everything is interconnected and is constantly changing. It's fluid. But also with the main sort of perspective is looking at it through, are the relationships between the community environment and maybe the community resources, is that a positive one? Is the relationship between the infrastructure and the mission also positive there? When you have positive relationships throughout these quadrants here, it begins to work in your favor. There's productivity. It meets the expectations and is able to move forward in a productive and positive fashion. But at the same time, of course, you can have negative relationships within these areas here, which is going to impact, the different quadrants in some way or form. And so this is always fluid, constantly changing here. And so we're using this as a means of not only assessing, but also, looking at it, how we could restore balance back in the community here. And, when it comes to creating policy, it is always good to think of the impacts, right, that happen to organizations, that the impacts of the people. What is the entire picture going to look like if we were to implement this policy? Or is there a policy that we can create where, there are positive externalities or positive impacts all around? And so this is sort of a framework that is able to help guide folks through that process and really think about it from that larger perspective. Now, again, when we look at balanced and imbalanced communities, we're looking at the relationships and what they look like. So within the guide, we have defined what a balanced community is. It reflects our harmonious relationship among the community quadrants. But we also have the imbalanced description there and some examples. And so, we're continuing to tweak a lot of our content here and some examples, and I think we're definitely going to try to squeeze in more of an example that is on the mental health aspect, behavioral health aspect. But at the same time, we also wanted to put an example in here using reservation crime as something that is real, that is happening. And so the example basically is giving folks an idea about what a balanced community may look like. And then on the lower half of the page, you'll look and see about what a imbalanced community may look like. When it comes to crime on the reservation, or things that are disrupting the community, we also look at, well, what sort of is playing into this situation? Does maybe tribal police have enough resources? Do folks that are working for the police department know their job, have proper training? Is there investment that is made in these areas? So all those factors, they play into this larger scenario and situation and impact, obviously, the outcome. One of the outcomes, of course, in this example is reservation crime. Is it up? Is it down? But just know that what we're looking at is the relationships and these factors. How are they coming together to work in favor of one another and be able to produce a positive outcome? Or maybe how are they working against each other? Maybe are there critical aspects of this and community factors that might be missing, that is creating a disconnect between all of those tribal communities? And so we provide that in the guide, and we also provide some guiding questions, and thinking about, policy, and really asking some very direct questions of how policy will incorporate or holistically incorporate those community level quadrants there. Is it basically inclusive? Is it thinking about all those factors that might shift or change, the outcome? Does the policy consider variables that may disrupt the balance? As you probably all know, politics in every shape or form can impact the outcome of a community, the outcome of an organization. And we like to say it doesn't, but I know there is always an influence there. And so that's just an example. There could be other variables that can disrupt the balance within the community. But then there are also factors that come into harmony that allow the community to achieve its goals and perform with excellence. One of the factors and one of the things we've seen is of course, trauma, can impact and be a factor that, is possibly a barrier to achieving success at times. The vicarious trauma, definitely impacts a lot of our employees. But thinking about things in a positive light, we also look at, well, leadership. We've seen some very outstanding leaders within the tribal systems of care community that have championed, their systems of care and are now sustainable. So they're a huge factor, right, in achieving its goals and performing with excellence. And so that's a question that we place in the guide to help guide this whole process and to be able to, again, think about, all of these aspects and areas. And in a sense, again, when developing policy, it's using this framework to inform, to strengthen your policy to be effective. Effectiveness, that could be for you to decide, but it often means that, is it equitable? Is it inclusive? Does it consider, the community and the context that you're in, whether that be tribal, whether that be an African American population or other particular context there. So that's the main framework that we work with and we thoroughly describe within our guide. Now, we all know that this work is not done alone, and it definitely takes a village to come together and a community to come together to work on this and to be effective. And so we made sure to put in strategies and also talk about the importance of engaging partners. And of course, it's all about relationships. That is key in how we get things done. Relationships with our families, relationships with our organizations, our partners, relationships with the county. So we talk about that in the guide, and we offer strategies. For example, being solutions-focused, strength-based, open to ideas. And another strategy is providing opportunities for youth and elders, and not just the leaders or the management staff. No, but getting everyone involved, because again, it's a community-wide effort. A part of this, we also developed a roles chart And when I say roles, I mean community roles. There's all sorts of folks within a community. And when we think about that, again, it's including our youth and families, but also school counselors, tribal employees, medicine people, our educators. So how could everyone play a part in that? And we feel that everyone does have a role or can have a role in being a part of this process of developing effective policy that's going to work for everyone all around. And so we lay that out and provide some direction and guidance in that area there. Now, in talking about policy, there are a variety of different frameworks, of styles, but what we've done is again, tried to keep this clear and not too cluttered. So we organized this policy process into 5 phases using the relational worldview format that has take-home messages that are summing up basically the process there. And so if we move forward, you'll see that our phases are in those 5 areas there, where we identify, imbalance, and engage partners, research and plan, we write, implement, and evaluate. Now, this is a very standard approach, and it's probably nothing new. And again, there are so many different policy types of images out there that display similar, if not the same types of work. So it's not so much that it's like this is like really important, but I mean, what we just try to do is make sure that the critical pieces of information are there, are important in terms of being able to identify, your policy imbalance. And that's the other piece too I wanted to mention, is that within the language, we didn't use problem, we didn't use issue or anything sort of negative, but we tried to really identify what people would normally call problems as imbalances, because imbalances, again, speak to more within that tribal context and understanding this is a problem here. And again, we tried to basically model what we also are talking about within the particular guide here. And so moving forward, we're just going to show you one phase of this particular guide. And as you can see, it's divided up into those community quadrants of the environment, infrastructure, resources, and mission. And so what we've done is to think about the policy process through that holistic perspective. We try to continue that line of thought. And so again, you look in the environment, one of the first things is identifying imbalances in the community. You look at the infrastructure, which you'll see a little bit of what that is, standards of practice, maybe your strategic plan or your service delivery in a community. So looking at, what sort of questions or basically what needs to be done in this first aspect, or at least thought about in order to move forward with enough information and detail. And so we thought about, again, what needs to happen in this early policy development stage that includes all these areas here. And you'll see at the very bottom is the take-home messages, which is summing up this process, identifying that imbalance, researching the impact on the community members, engaging partners, interest groups, collecting needs to decide if the policy is appropriate, that maybe the ideas that you're working with you want to pursue, or maybe they're not the best ideas and maybe you need to go back to the drawing board. But being basically saying, if all these things that you're doing and working towards, you're collecting these things, then that basically is gearing you towards that second phase of the research and planning aspect. And so we have 5 phases in those areas here that we provide in the guide. Now, the checklist here is really to be user-friendly, to help highlight some of those important steps and actions that are a part of this whole process and experience here. We try to maintain that format of the relational worldview and really be succinct in what we're providing here. And so this is what it looks like, and just for I believe the first phase. And so just for some people, they may not need to look at the phases, but they just want to make sure that they're on par with this policy phase or the policy process. So they may just open our guide and go straight to the checklist. And so this checklist, again, is really highlighting those important actions that are occurring in this early stage of policy development here. And you'll see it again as in that relational worldview piece. Now, as you all know, when trying to address community challenges, you're always going to run into barriers, and you're always going to run into some sort of issue or imbalance. And that could come in the form of people, could come in the form of systems, or even maybe could be community norms that are just not working for the community. And so what you see in this slide here is on the left-hand side, we have potential challenges to policy development and implementation. And these are challenges that are specific to a tribal context, such as historical intergenerational trauma. We have a lot of folks that still are impacted by this, and it could at times be a barrier to this process here. Maybe the community thinks that the policy is too controlling, like why do you need to create a policy that's going to be my business, and taking away freedom of public choice. So we just came up with a couple of different scenarios, but also we wanted to make sure we had strategies to address these challenges, so trying to basically show how the policy restores harmony and balance in the community, or understanding the issue through the community's lens, even utilizing elder wisdom and guidance, incorporating cultural teachings in the practice could all, play a role in addressing and overcoming some of these potential challenges here. And so we have listed a variety. There's a couple pages of these challenges here that we have. With the tools aspect, we have an environmental scan that allows you to assess the environment, the physical environment, the political environment, the basically environment that could be a lot of different spaces. But we look at it through that holistic lens and ask some critical questions there. And so what you see that is in the colored areas here is either imbalance identified or no imbalance. So we tried to provide guidance to where this is what it may lead to, an imbalance identified, or maybe there's no imbalance identified. And so we tried to at least provide. There's obviously more information that you're able. This is sort of the ending of the environmental scan. It provides that you either come to the conclusion of imbalance or there's no imbalance there. But we've also provided a community readiness example, or at least a reference, which is through the Tri-Ethnic Center. And some of you are familiar with probably the community readiness model through that particular center there. But we also have a sample timeline to give folks an idea about how long this may take, but also policies that come in the form of tribal resolutions. We have those pieces as well attached in the guide. And then on the writing, providing basic tips on style, content, tone. We do have an emphasis on tribal language and thinking about how your tribal language can be incorporated into writing policy, because it is important certainly to use traditional knowledge and practice to continue making sure that your culture is used as a resource and used as a means of maybe addressing some of the serious challenges that are facing your community there. And so there's guidance in those areas, and a lot of basic mechanics as well when it comes to policy. We do have an aspect of the guide where it talks about the research and evaluation piece, where we define what is qualitative and quantitative data, offering examples, in those areas, such as like how to ask questions or how data can be collected. We cover some research methods, community-based participatory research, but I also talked about mixed methods research and incorporating that in order to maybe have a little bit of both of quant as well as qualitative data. But we also have guidance on setting up data evaluation and kind of a basic outline and where to get started. We don't go too deep in this area here, but at least just give enough information so that folks are able to get started. We really try to follow the practice, or at least the idea that if you research what the community values, the community will value what you research. And so that's within the guide as well. I wanted to kind of come to a close here and see if any folks had any questions or feedback or suggestions on this guide here. Other than, can we see it, or can you provide us with more information? We'll definitely try to get there as soon as possible, but we are in the process of whittling the content down and certainly gathering tribal feedback as we speak, and looking to create an online version of this guide so that folks can maybe even print it out and have it be accessible to that online portal. But we anticipate to finish around spring this year, and so it's been a long time coming, but we're really excited, and we're just glad you're part of this webinar to hear. For you to hear sort of what we've been working on, because honestly, again, for tribal communities to work with policy, it certainly can be a tool for effectiveness, can be a tool to maintain and sustain your programming, but we want to make sure that, is this content, is the language we're using, is it also culturally informed? Because that is very important when it comes to delivering services or using a framework that is applicable or relates to tribal communities. Because what we're seeing within a lot of our systems of care communities is tribes are indigenizing things, are using tools, are using resources, are using language that is speaking to who they are as a sovereign nation. And so this is sort of that indigenized process as well, indigenizing policy. And so we hope this will be effective. But I want to stop there and open it up and see if folks had questions. And you can even type questions as well. You don't have to, talk. I think Peggy Helmquist is typing in a question. Okay, so Peggy asked, in doing policy, are you also going to be looking at assuring culturally equity programming and taking a sovereign nation approach? We definitely are. I think we're also making sure that it is not only fitting the cultural context, but is this also equitable for the various populations within a tribal community. And what comes to mind is some of our LGBTQ populations, Two-Spirit populations that are part of the, of course, our community that, do have unique perspectives and some unique needs. And so we definitely are going to be looking at that. And I feel like we're still exploring in what that could look like and looking at how we can expand upon that within this policy guidance. So I think it's definitely something where we want to address and make sure that we're providing information on. So yes. Is there any other questions folks have? Okay. Well, I guess if there's no other questions, I know there is a evaluation to take after this call, and so appreciate any feedback that you can offer. And I just wanted to thank everyone for being a part of this webinar. There's more to come. This is just, the first phase and really just a preview of what's to come. And so I want to thank everyone for joining us on this webinar, and look forward to interacting with all of you in the future. Thank you.